I'm really terribly honored to be here tonight, and it was really a great treat to be there in the awards ceremony. It reminds me of what a special place this university, this college is. I mean, after all, I would have thought the Biblical Joseph Award was for economic forecasting. And of course, I grew up here in Manhattan, so I'm always glad to be home. I want to start with a picture of America. And I call this a picture to really reinforce how completely lacking in any aesthetic sense I am. What this is I've taken the 3,000-odd counties in the United States and I've sorted them on the basis of density, people per square mile. Because at their heart, cities are the absence of physical space between people and firms. Cities are density, they are proximity, they're closeness. Okay? And what you can see here is I've ranked the counties in each dot is 300-odd counties by the people per square mile. And the bottom line shows the relationship between people per square mile and income levels. And what you see is that the densest tenth of America's counties have incomes that are on average 50% higher than the least dense half of America's counties. This is a pervasive fact both in the United States and throughout the world. The three largest metropolitan areas in the U.S. produce 18% of America's GDP, while including only 13% of America's population. And if the rest of America saw their per capita productivity levels rise to those seen in the New York metropolitan area, our national incomes would go up by 43%. Now, there's a long economics literature trying to understand this, whether or not this is actually a treatment effect of proximity, or if it's just because more able people choose to live in cities, a flattering thought to many of us, or is it because cities have intrinsic natural advantages, like access to coal mines or to a harbor, which then induce both people to move there and keep productivity high. I'm not going to go into the literally scores of papers that have been written on this, but I think many of us have been convinced that this is actually a treatment effect, not just a random fact of sorting into cities. And one of the key pieces of evidence here, which I think is helpful to keep in the back of your mind, is that when people come to cities, they don't see their wages immediately shoot up. What happens is they experience faster wage growth year after year, decade after decade, right? And that's I think, a clue as to what cities are actually doing in the modern world. But it's not, the fact that you do see gains within these people who move really does push against just the selection hypothesis. And there are, of course, reams of other papers pushing against that view. And it's very hard to think. I mean, the harbor was a huge asset in 1830, but it's hard to think of what natural advantage could explain the particular strength of cities today. Now, the top line may be somewhat more surprising. It shows the change in population growth between 2000 and 2010 as a percentage, of course, of 2000 population, relating it to density. And what you can see is that until you get to the very top tenth, population growth is systematically faster in those places that started off with less land, right? Far from leaving the dense enclaves of the eastern coast and populating the great empty spaces of the U.S. as Americans did in the early 19th century. At the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we're clustering in. We're moving to these dense clusters, in part, of course, because they are more prosperous. This is the relationship between population growth between 2000 and 2010 and income as of the year 2000 across counties in the U.S., splitting them in this case into fifths. And it's no surprise, when you look at this, that the higher income, denser counties have attracted people because there's such a pervasive tendency. The richest fifth of America's counties experienced population growth on average of 15%. The poorest fifth lost population. Now, the success of our urban areas shows up in lots of different ways. One of the things that's been interesting is that in the wake of the great housing recession, we've actually seen more of a comeback in multifamily permits than in single-family permits. So the top line shows single-family permits. The bottom line shows multifamily permits. And although it's a different scale, I mean, America is still building overwhelmingly for single-family units, you can see there's been a 50% increase since the bottom of the market in terms of the multifamily units, and basically no change in the single-family units. And multifamily units are really those that are delivered typically in the core of urban areas. Now, within cities, you also see a sort of similar phenomenon of centralized success. This is during the boom, and what I've done is I've taken the Case-Shiller zip code level repeat sales indices for housing prices. So this shows the growth in housing prices, and I've ranked the zip codes by miles from the city center, the central business district. Okay, and what you can see is it's not as strong as the other graphs I've shown you, but there's a systematic relationship where the boom was strongest in city centers. This was not, by the way, true of the 1980s boom. The 1980s boom was much more of a suburban boom, but the 2001 to 2006 boom was a centralized boom. Now, we don't know, in this case, whether or not fully what's happened to city centers in the bust. In some cases, by and large, the places that gained during the boom gave up during the bust. And this is just a remarkable feature, and it reminds us of what a sort of ephemeral tsunami the great housing crisis of the last 10 years has been. What I'm showing you here is the percent change in price between 2001 and 2006, okay, along the x-axis. Along the y-axis is the percent change in price between 2006 and 2011, denominated by 2001 prices. So they're actually exactly comparable units. Okay, so normally, housing markets experience mean reversion. For every dollar a housing market goes up over a 5-year period, it typically gives back 32 cents of that gain over the next 5 years. For those of you who are students, if you ever hear a real estate agent tell you, well, you know, prices have been going up a lot lately, so you should be, you know, thinking that the price growth is going to continue. Remember, the statistics show exactly the reverse, right? It tends to show that those places that do well historically have done poorly. Now, this is nothing like the 32 cents give back. This is a 95 cents give back. The coefficient in this regression is 0.95. It really is sort of absolutely perfect in terms of the comeback. Now, there are some places that did worse than the regression line. Las Vegas had a particular cataclysmic decline. And there are some places that seem to have done well. Midland, Texas, and Washington, D.C. stand out, apparently being the home of George W. Bush was particularly salutary during the 2001 to 2011 period. But in general, places that did well gave back. And you certainly see this in some of the variables that are correlated with growth during the early period, during the 2001-2006 period. For some reason, January temperature was very strongly associated with this boom. This is the relationship across metropolitan areas between January temperature and average price growth between 2001 and 2006. We don't know why, right? One story is just people extrapolated from the general American tendency of moving towards the sun that somehow or other price growth would go through the roof because of this Sun Belt trend, forgetting the fact that one of the reasons why the Sun Belt is growing is because it's so easy to build houses there, right? And that excess supply in the long run has got to keep prices down. And indeed, that's exactly what we saw. So this is the relationship. Wait, something bad happened. Okay, this is the relationship between January temperature and price declines. Okay, so January temperature predicted the boom, it predicted the decline. On that, there's no relationship between 2001 and 2011 in January temperature. It just came and went. It's like irrational exuberance abhors cold winters or something. This is the relationship between 2001 and 2008 between this zip code level measure. The problem is we don't have the Case-Shiller zip code level data after 2008. So you can move it on to a period during the bust, but we don't fully know what happened. But certainly what we're seeing over the longer time period is that the most robust areas have tended to be in the city centers even as late as 2008. So you can see the price growth in this closest area is 28% or so, less than 20% outside. Now, and we certainly feel this in the continuing robustness of the market right here in Manhattan. In so many ways in the US, you know, central cities are strong. They have high incomes, they have high housing prices, which reflect individual demand for that. They can continue to be robust centers of cultural and other forms of innovation. But whatever is going on in the US and cities is nothing relative to the role that cities are playing in the developing world, right? We've just passed this remarkable halfway point where more than half of humanity lives in cities. And it's hard not to think that on net, that's a good thing, because if you compare those countries that are more than 50% urbanized to those countries that are less than 50% urbanized, the more urbanized countries have incomes that are on average 50%, that are average 5 times higher, and infant mortality levels that are less than a third. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is causal, but the correlation is such that it is very hard to find any country that has moved from poverty to prosperity that has not, in fact, urbanized at the same time, that cities really do appear to be critical pathways that are part of this transformation. They're so often the conduits across civilizations and countries. Gandhi famously said that the growth of the nation depends not on cities, but on its villages. With all due respects to the great man, he was completely and utterly wrong. The growth of India does not depend on its villages. It depends on its cities. It depends on places like Bangalore, right? And these are two images from Bangalore. From a U.S. perspective, Bangalore feels like a flat world phenomenon, the place on the edge of nowhere that you call when your Boingo account goes down. From an Indian perspective, it's exactly the opposite, right? It's the quintessence of proximity. It's jam-packed full of smart software entrepreneurs and smart engineers who come together to be near each other. This picture, this glossy building over here, is the Mindtree campus. Mindtree is a flat world phenomenon. It's a software consulting firm. And on any given day, the roof of this building, right, everyone has lunch together. all crammed together on this route, connecting with one another, learning from one another, and the place is also filled with visitors from outside the world, Silicon Valley software experts, Singapore investors, even the occasional socially awkward Harvard professor. Right? All of these things are going on in this place that is sort of remarkably productive, remarkably connected to the outside world. And of course, one of the assets of this industry is that they can survive without having to use Indian roads. That unlike traditional manufacturing, they can deliver stuff to the outside world in cyberspace, which frees them from the dependence on the underproductive Indian public sector. And indeed, you get a sense of that outside here. So this is Bangalore outside of Mindtree. It's a world that's being pulled up by entrepreneurs like Mindtree. It's a world in which there's a whole ecosystem, economic ecosystem that's built around the success of the textiles and software industry in Bangalore. But it's also a system that is often lacking, right? And as much as I'm discussing the strengths of cities, I will return later, but I don't want in any sense to emphasize the enormous challenges that the cities of the developing world continue to face. Right? The case that I will try to build is the right response to those challenges is not to just give up and say that everyone should continue to live on farms, but rather that we actually have to have public policies that actually meet those challenges. Now, one way, one of the things I think to fight against in this tendency to think that people should live on farms is the view that in the rural past is some kind of bucolic lost world, that it's tragic that we're losing in cities. Anyone who thinks the rural past is some kind of bucolic lost world has never been to rural India, right? Because this is not any kind of a bucolic world. This is a world of unending cycles of poverty filled with infants dying and disease repeating itself. It's a world without change. And cities offer the possibility of transforming from this. This is happiness. Okay, now, I fought very hard against having the publisher include the word happier in the title of my book. Right? It sort of profoundly disturbed me. And it's actually not true in the US that there's any correlation between living in a city and happiness. Indeed, I'm an urban economist who believes in something like a spatial equilibrium, that there's no such thing as a free lunch in terms of where you live, just as there's no such thing as a free lunch in terms of most of the other things. So, and in the US, just think about it. What self-respecting New Yorker is going to admit to a poll taker that they're so happy? I mean, it just sort of beggars the mind. But in the developing world, there's a strong correlation between urbanization and self-reported happiness. This is across countries. It holds even true for income, that self-reported life satisfaction is significantly higher in more urbanized countries. And in the developing world, people who live in urbanized areas report that they're considerably happier than people who don't live in urbanized areas. And I think that should remind us that it's not as if, the people who move to cities are making some sort of a mistake. Right? They're moving by the millions to cities precisely because cities are offering a brighter future. Now, in some sense, the success of cities is something of a paradox. We live in a world in which distance is dead, in which we can effortlessly telecommute any place we want to across the planet, in which we could all occupy whatever sylvan spot appeals to our biophilia and just dial it in. And yet, in so many ways, in so many places, we choose the inconveniences of city life. We choose to put up with all of these costs to be around each other. 25 years ago, the cyberseers and the techno-prophets told us that we would all give this up, that we would all move to rural Montana and occupy electronic cottages and just connect it at long distances. But that hasn't happened. Why not? Why didn't this happen? Why didn't the death of distance make urban proximity obsolete? And that's the paradox that I'm going to return to later. In some sense, the success of cities is even more surprising with some historical perspective. I mentioned that I was born in New York. I was born in New York in 1967. And these are two iconic images from the New York of my youth. Right? The image on your left was Ford's response to the fiscal crisis in the cities in the 1970s, when New York hit by a tremendous economic downturn. Remember, the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s was not automobile production in Detroit. It was garment production right here in New York City. And far more than automobile production, garment production was hammered by globalization in the 60s and early 70s. 500,000 jobs lost in a very short number of years. Accompanying this economic distress was crime rates that felt like they were out of control, social distress, and fiscal mismanagement of various forms under Mayor John Lindsay and Abe Beame. Ford, it seemed not as if not just Ford, who actually never literally said drop dead, but it seemed as if not only Ford, but history itself was telling New York to drop dead, that indeed this city would go forward to some sort of Planet of the Apes future where we would just be, the Statue of Liberty would be covered up by sand, or as you can see Jimmy Carter wandering through the wasteland that the South Bronx had become, that we were, just going back to the weeds and the plants. Now, in some sense, the future of cities seemed so tenuous in the 1970s because the very function, the original function that cities had come about to serve had essentially become obsolete. If you think about why America's urban network came about, it came about to solve a transportation problem. In 1816, we sat on the edge of this vast continent with enormous resources in the hinterland, and yet those resources were virtually inaccessible. In 1816, it cost as much to ship goods 30 miles over land as it did to ship them across the entire Atlantic Ocean. It was just that expensive to reach into the American interior. And over the course of the 19th century, we built this amazing transportation network. We built the Erie and then the Illinois and Michigan canals. We built railroads that then accompanied them. And cities grew up at critical pinch points along that river network system, along that water network system. Every one of the 20 largest American cities in 1900 was on a major waterway, from the oldest, typically where the river meets the sea, like New York and Boston, to the newest, Minneapolis, on the northernmost navigable point on the Mississippi River. And indeed, cities grew up around these transportation cost advantages, right? They grew up around the pinch points on the network, on the point, on the westernmost terminus of the Erie Canal, where you had to move the goods, lifted by Joseph Dart's famous grain elevators, from the boats that would ply the Great Lakes to the canal boats, right? You would build it on Chicago, right? A linchpin of a great watery arc that went all the way from New York to New Orleans. And of course, you built it in New York. And industries grew up around those transportation hubs. Think about New York's three dominant industries in the 19th century: sugar refining, printing and publishing, and garment production. All three of these industries, like finance, are children of the port. Sugar refining, because of course we did a huge amount of trade with the Caribbean, and of course we had plenty of demand for sugar. You wanted to produce sugar in a central location because of the returns to scale in sugar refining, right? These were big factories by the standards of their time, but you couldn't refine sugar in the Caribbean in the 18th and 19th centuries because refined sugar crystals would coalesce during a long hot sea voyage and need to be refined again. So you put it in a central location, right? And you built large industries. Of course, the Domino sugar factories, famously of the Havermeyers, are the most famous parts of particularly the Brooklyn riverfront. But the fortune that put Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the White House started with Isaac Roosevelt's sugar refining in the 18th century. The garment trade also, fabric going through in the city, and plenty of demand, both by sailors and in slaves that we were trading with in the South for ready-made clothes. And so we pioneered this industry in the 1820s. My favorite story, though, is about printing and publishing. The big money in 19th century printing and publishing, early 19th century printing and publishing, was in pirated English novels, right? They had no copyright protection, and no Eastern market thief of our property rights had anything on our boys in the 1820s, right? We did this to a T. Now the problem with printing pirated English novels, or pirated any novels, is you really do have to publish first. There's no money in having the 8th pirated edition of Girl with a Dragon Tattoo, right? And that gave a huge advantage to speed, to access. Because New York was the port, this meant that it had the first access to pirated English novels. The Harper Brothers, right, New York's uber publishers, right, got access to the latest Sir Walter Scott novel, Peveril the Peak, right, on days before it would even get to their Philadelphia competitors, Carey and Lee. And they would be able to produce runs of this book in 24 hours. Right, and flood the market with it before their down-market competitors could even get it. The port made this possible. Now, of course, Chicago's great industry is the stockyards. Right? The stockyards were part of solving a transportation problem, in this case, a problem of moving corn and wheat. Okay? America then and now is a great country for producing grains. The problem is that grains are relatively expensive to ship. Over the course of the 19th century, we figured out more cost-effective means to ship grain. Originally, of course, we transformed grain into whiskey, which is a highly portable, and usually demand for this product is pretty high. And then they moved it into salted pork and to a lesser extent salted beef. And then, of course, when we figured out refrigerated rail cars, okay, and the guy who figured it out was this guy Armour, the key idea was you put the blocks of ice on top rather than below the beef. So the water drips down and keeps the beef cold while you're shipping it across the country. After that point in time, you could actually slaughter the beef in a large facility closer to the point of production, thereby saving huge amounts in the production costs. Now, everything that I'm telling you so far makes cities seem like they're part of a solution to an operations research problem, that we're all sort of minimizing costs and that's everything that's going on. But of course, even when cities form for the most mundane of all purposes, like getting grain-fed Iowa beef slaughtered and put on rail cars moving east, miracles happen when smart people come together to learn from one another and borrow ideas from one another. Think about Renaissance Florence, where Brunelleschi figures out the basic mathematics of linear perspective, of how the human eye sees things and creating the illusion of three-dimensionality. He passes it along to his friend Donatello, who puts it in low-relief sculpture. Passes it along to his friend Masaccio, who puts it in painting on the wall of the Brancacci Chapel. Passes it along to his student, that less than saintly monk, Fra Filippo Lippi, who passes it along to Botticelli and so forth. A chain of genius, each person building on one another. This is what cities do when they work most magically. Right? And this is what happened when Socrates and Plato bickered on an Athenian street corner. And this is what happened in 1880 Chicago. What you're looking at is the first skyscraper. A skyscraper being defined as a relatively tall building with a load-bearing steel or cast iron skeleton. This building, the home insurance building in Chicago, architect William LeBaron Jenney, is often called, that building, not Trinity Church, Wall Street, is called often the first skyscraper. Okay? But there is a lively architectural history debate about this, as indeed there seems to be a lively architectural history debate about everything. Right? Because in fact, this thing is not a true skyscraper. Only the front two walls have a steel skeleton. The back two walls have traditional masonry walls, thick walls, right? And there were certainly other people at the same time who had this idea of a cast iron skeleton. Indeed, there were plenty of industrial buildings that had this idea going forward. So, of course, there are champions of individual people. You know, is it Louis Sullivan who should be called the father of the skyscraper, or is it Daniel Burnham, or is it Adler, or is it Root? But any of this quest to establish the sole father of the skyscraper misses the point. The skyscraper, like almost everything else our species has done that is worth anything, is a collaborative innovation. All these guys knew each other. Louis Sullivan and Daniel Burnham were both apprentices in Jenney's office. Right? They all borrowed each other's ideas. They all used the same contractor, the great fireproofing engineer Peter B. White. Right? They all borrowed ideas from each other. Everything was in the air. It was collectively they produced this. Collectively they built on each other's work. Each idea pushed the things further, just like in Renaissance Florence. And this is how they collaboratively created this amazing thing that transformed the city, that was in fact using this remarkable form of public transportation, the elevator, to enable cities to move up rather than out. A similar chain of innovation occurred in Detroit a decade later. Americans, contrary to what you may have heard from President Obama, Americans did not in fact invent the automobile. But we did in fact figure out how to mass produce it cheaply, taking technology that had been worked out in German cities. And indeed, in the 1890s, there was very much of a great horse race, if you will, among American tinkerers to figure out how to produce the mass-produced car. In fact, the largest center in the 1890s for automobile production in the U.S. was right here in New York. But of course, we didn't end up being the great center for car production. Instead, it happened in a great inland port, right, that occurred for all those operations, that existed for all those operations research reasons, Detroit, the Straits. And it was natural that a great inland port would have a company like Detroit Dry Dock, a company that specialized in making engines and boats for inland transportation. Detroit Dry Dock then provided training for this character, the young Henry Ford, right, who came from the farm and got his start working on engines, working on these boats in the center of Ford then moved on, worked for Edison, and then joined this competitive circle of people in Detroit who were trying to figure out how to make cars cheaply. Now, according to legend, the first person to build a car in Detroit was Charles Kirby. According to legend, Ford followed Kirby on a bicycle as he drove his car down the streets of Detroit, desperately trying to figure out how Kirby's car worked. Right? I don't think this story is actually true, but I love it because it sort of epitomizes the role that cities can play for ensuring the transmission of ideas. This fact that was established by Adam Jaffe and Manuel Trachtenberg, that in fact patent citations even today are clustered geographically, that people are more likely to cite patents that are physically close to them, right? So was it in the 1890s in Detroit, where it's not just about Ford coming up with a big idea. It's not some lone solitary genius. He is part of a cluster. It's part of it's the Dodge brothers, the Fisher brothers, David Dunbar, Buick, Ransom Olds, Billy Durant and nearby Flint, all of whom work together, are borrowing each other's ideas, are supplying each other with parts and financing, and collectively they create this amazing thing, the cheap mass-produced automobile. The problem with the innovation is that Ford's big idea is this, right? Vast vertically integrated factory, walled off from the outside world, employing tens of thousands of less educated workers. In the short run, this is a great model for productivity. In fact, by many measures, Detroit appears to be the most productive place on the planet in 1950. But for the long run, it's a terrible model for urban reinvention. Successful cities in the early 19th century, in the time of Alexander Hamilton's New York or Matthew Boulton's Birmingham, successful cities were marked by small firms, smart people, and connections to the outside world. The same three factors are associated with urban success today. It's not that these factories, right, are bad things, right? They're enormously productive, but they're fundamentally not urban. They don't need cities, right? Once you're vertically integrated, you have nothing to gain with the firms from the firms around you, and nothing to contribute to them either. You might as well move the factory to the suburbs, or heck, once transportation costs fall, you might as well move it to lower wage locations. And that's, of course, exactly what happened. Over the course of the 20th century, the real cost of moving goods plummeted. This is the cost of moving a ton a mile by rail in real dollars over the 20th century, a 90% decline. And that's just one of the many transportation technology innovations over this time period. And so while at the start of the 20th century, it made sense to keep production in places like Detroit that had access to those old waterways and rail yards, by the middle of the 20th century, you might as well move it to low-cost areas. The work of Tom Holmes compares counties right on the border of right-to-work and pro-union states, and finds a dramatic increase at the spatial border in the amount of industrial growth after 1947, that the firms just fled the pro-union states to the right-to-work states, unsurprisingly going to areas that are lower cost. Now, one way to think about this is that at the start of the 19th century, our cities were located in places where producers had a competitive advantage, like access to rails or waterways or coal mines. But as transportation costs plummeted, we increasingly moved our cities to places where people wanted to live. And there is no variable that better predicts metropolitan area growth in the 20th century than January temperature, right? That continues to be true over the last 10 years as well. That we have continued to move towards warmer places. Now, there are many things that are rolled up in this. It's also about warmer places generally having more pro-business policies. It's also because warmer places typically make it easier to build. But some part of it, certainly, is the fact that people have moved towards consumer cities that deliver consumer amenities like warm January temperatures. Now, along with the move to sun, having trouble with this, was the move to sprawl. We have always built our living spaces around the transportation technology that was dominant in the era in which the place was being built. Think about the downtown areas in New York, right? Built before the dominance of wheeled transport, shorter blocks, curving streets, right? This was the pedestrian era, right? Or think about the older parts of European cities, or Jerusalem at perhaps its most extreme. This is a city built around walking, right? And then indeed in 1811, right? Think about the grid. The grids accommodate wheeled transportation, right? Larger blocks, wider streets, right? And then, of course, think about the move uptown, which was made possible by steam trains, the move to streetcar suburbs outside of Boston, the move to the main line in Philadelphia, always accommodating new transportation technologies of their time period. The car is just another transportation technology, and unsurprisingly, just as we had built sprawl for the subway, we built sprawl for the car. Now, the average commute by car in this country is 24 minutes. The average commute by public transit is 48 minutes because there is a fixed time cost of accessing the subway or the bus of 15 to 20 minutes of walking to the stop, waiting for the thing to come and pick you up, and then taking you away. It's not surprising that Americans move to cars. And it's not surprising that we rebuilt our spaces. This is an image of Levittown, mass-produced housing around the car. And this is an image of the Woodlands outside of Houston, which shows a considerably more luxurious form of relatively mass-produced housing built around the automobile. This place is enormously pleasant if you can put up with the heat, and enormously cheap because mass-produced, low-density housing can be incredibly inexpensive. Of course, the issue with the car is not that people necessarily made these choices, but that the government continues to subsidize them, and the government did subsidize. The work of Nathaniel Bound Snow at Brown finds that each new highway that cut into an urban center reduced the central city's population by about 18% relative to the rest of the metropolitan area. And we continue to believe that we should be subsidizing highways with general tax revenues. Indeed, the president's current budget is very heavy on subsidies for highways that are not being paid for out of the Highway Trust Fund. it's very hard to see why we wouldn't be funding this with user fees, which means either gas taxes or better yet, something like tolling related fees. Now, hit by the move to sun and sprawl by deindustrialization, almost all of America's larger cities declined substantially. These were the 10 largest American cities as of 1950. 8 of them lost 20% or more of their population over the next 50 years. 3 of them lost 48% of their population or more, right? New York is a remarkable outlier. The resilience of this city is absolutely shocking relative to the other 10 cities. And many things came to do with that. It came together with this New York's remarkable connection to the outside world, its culture of entrepreneurship, its relative diversity of other cities. But look at poor Detroit, which lost 52% of its population between 1950 and 2000, and it lost another 25% of its population over the last decade alone. Now, the decline is not just economics. Along with these declines came a rise in crime rates, a loss of, feeling that civilization, which itself had been created by cities, had left them. This is an image of the Detroit riot from 1967. And the federal government wasn't particularly there to help, right? It was spending money, but it was following a Potemkin village strategy that pretended that cities were about physical structures and infrastructure rather than the people who live in the city. Because the real heart of the city is always the human capital, not the physical capital. And if you build infrastructure that has relatively low value added, you're not doing anyone any good. More than 90% of the homes in central city Detroit are currently valued significantly below construction costs. Right? It makes absolutely no sense to subsidize building in central city Detroit, and it didn't make any sense to do it in the 50s and 60s, but that's exactly what when the city was already losing a massive population. But that's exactly what the federal government was there to subsidize with urban renewal dollars. Right? After the Federal Highway Aid Act of 1973, the federal government was there to support public transit systems, like this one, the monorail, Detroit's people mover. It's like a Simpsons episode, okay? It glides over essentially empty streets. It is easy to get around Detroit. It was a city built for 1.85 million people that has now 750,000 people in it. You couldn't possibly need a monorail in this city. It's like a Simpsons episode. And yet this is exactly what, because the people of Detroit weren't paying for this is what the federal government thought they should have. This is exactly what Detroit built. Gives politicians a shiny new thing to cut a ribbon on, and does very little for the city as a whole, which actually needed better schools and more safety, and above all, the entrepreneurship that is really central in urban success. Now, luckily, the story doesn't end there. Whereas pretty much all of America's older, colder cities looked like they were headed for enormous trouble in the 1970s, cities have substantially diverged since then. Remember, in 1971, 2 real estate jokers put up a sign on the highway out of Seattle, asking the last person to leave the city to please turn out the lights. Okay, because Boeing was reducing its employment. No one could imagine Seattle's future with Boeing cutting back jobs, just like no one could imagine Detroit's future with a smaller GM. Right? This was before Starbucks, this is before Microsoft, this is before Amazon, this is before Costco. The city absolutely transformed itself, not through urban renewal dollars, but through private entrepreneurship, built above all on the skills of the city. Right? More than 50% of the adults in the central city of Seattle have college degrees, as opposed to about 12% in the city of Detroit. Boston's reinvention, very tightly tied to the university system. This is Vannevar Bush, right, of Raytheon, an early pioneer of connections between the university and entrepreneurship. He would also be the mentor of Fred Terman, who would later go on to be the dean and later provost of Stanford, who built Stanford Industrial Park, right, the paragon of sort of university entrepreneurship connection. This is the Arthur D. Little building at MIT. Arthur D. Little was the MIT chemist who started the Arthur D. Little Company, the initial beginning of MIT's foray into supporting business. Now, the work of Enrico Moretti at Berkeley finds that having a land-grant college in your metropolitan area prior to 1940 is associated with remarkable economic effects in the last 2 or 3 decades. That actually this type of educational investment is one of the things that really do seem to matter for cities. And lest you think land-grant colleges just mean places in Oklahoma that you've never heard of, MIT, land-grant college. Now, of course, New York's story is intimately associated with finance. At its peak in 2008, 44% of the payroll on the island of Manhattan was paid in finance and insurance. Right? On one level, the story of finance is about a chain of innovation, much like that gave us Renaissance art in Florence. A more sophisticated ability to think about the trade-off between risk and return was developed. We can argue about this, but let's give some credit to Jimmy Savage and Milton Friedman in the walls of the Social Science Building in Chicago. It's then carried, it's then taken up by people like Harry Markowitz and Sharp. These then ideas are then carried by people like the young Jack Traynor and Fisher Black to Wall Street. This quantitative approach to risk and return then enables the young Michael Milken to convince quantitatively trained investors that his high-yield debt, junk bonds if you will, carry enough return to offset the risk. That high-yield debt then enables the young Henry Kravis to engage in larger and larger leveraged buyouts, like, for example, the one that took over RJR Nabisco. Lou Ranieri in the securitization revolution is part of this transformation. Ranieri, of course, who started in the Salomon Brothers mailroom, is a remarkable reminder of cities' enduring ability to be forges of human capital. And that indeed is how I would interpret this fact that people who come to cities don't experience wage gains immediately, but rather wage growth, that they're actually accumulating human capital in the city. And Michael Bloomberg is part of this chain. Now, when I wrote the book, I was not an employee of Bloomberg View. I write every other week for Bloomberg View column, so take that as disclosure or advertising, whichever you prefer. But I keep this up because I like the Bloomberg image, and it reminds us of three things. One of which is Bloomberg's terminals are part of this chain of innovation. Secondly, Bloomberg has a remarkable ability of this tendency that cities have to enable cross-industry hops, cross-industry fertilization, right? Where you take an idea from one industry and you bring it somewhere else and you create something important as a result. Bloomberg, of course, is not a financial billionaire. He's an IT billionaire. Right? He, in some sense, is competing with the guys in Silicon Valley, but he's able to be so successful in terms of competing with them, in terms of supplying data and information technology products, because he's run the trading floor at Salomon Brothers, because he's run their technology operation, because he has the knowledge that no one sitting in splendid isolation at Atherton, California could possibly have, because he has the knowledge the city has given him. And this enables him to make this leap and be so successful as an entrepreneur. But there's a third reason that I keep this up, which is that it's a wall-less office. Modeled on this is the bullpen at City Hall, modeled on the bullpen at Bloomberg LLP, modeled on the Salomon Brothers trading floor. Now, there's something funny when you think about trading floors. Here you have some of the wealthiest people on the planet who in a normal industry would sit in vast offices surrounded by oaken desks and oaken walls, enjoying all the perquisites of privacy that their wealth has made possible. But here they are, sweating on top of each other, getting guacamole all over each other, feeling the heat because they need to know what's going on. Now, the trading floor is, in essence, it's the city writ small. Those trading floors are there because knowledge is more important than space. And that is fundamentally why cities came back as well, because knowledge is more important than space. And this gets to our paradox with which I started us off. The reason why globalization and new technologies are not destroying cities, but they're strengthening them, is that what globalization and new technologies are doing is they're increasing the returns to being smart. They're increasing the returns to innovation. They're increasing the complexity of the world. Right? And we are, at our heart, a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. We come out of the womb with this remarkable ability to pick up information from our parents, from our peers, from our siblings, even occasionally from our teachers. Right? Cities play to that. They enable us to get smart by being around other smart people. Okay? Anyone who has ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing your script. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through. And we have, over millions of years, evolved to having these remarkable cues for communicating comprehension or confusion that are lost when you're not in the same room. As the world becomes more complex, as the ideas that we're communicating become more difficult, the chance of them being lost in translation become even larger, and the advantages of being in the same room are larger. And that's why cities aren't making, why technology is not making cities obsolete. As long as ideas are the currency of the world, we will continue to want to be close to each other and close to other smart people. This, of course, explains why skills are such an important predictor of urban success, why Seattle has succeeded and Detroit has not. This is the connection across the entire U.S. between share of the population with a college degree as of 1970 and employment and population growth over the next 30 years. As you can see, it's a nice, robust, positive effect. But of course, it's vastly stronger in the Northeast and the Midwest. The top line showing growth of over 50% is the population growth for the most skilled fifth of metropolitan areas. The bottom one is the least skilled fifth of metropolitan areas. And this is a result that holds, controlling for any number of other things. Skills are human capital, is the bedrock on which urban success lasts. And if you want to understand why Boston looks different from Buffalo, they're both right on the regression line. Okay, they're both exactly what you should expect to see happen. This is after I wrote the book. This is the relationship across entire counties in the U.S. between populations share with BA in 2000 and subsequent growth. This is the relationship between per capita GDP and share of the population with a college degree across metropolitan areas. And this is the relationship between what we call the log wage residual. So this is something that's called human capital externalities. But basically what you do here is you control for your years of schooling. Okay, and the general effect that schooling has raising your incomes. And then you take the residual from that, from controlling for your stuff, and then average it up at the metropolitan area level, and then connect it to the share of the population in the metropolitan area with a college degree. This work was originally done by Jim Rausch, and most recently followed up by Enrico Moretti. As the share of the population with a college degree in your metropolitan area goes up by about 10%, Your wages go up by about 8%, holding your own years of schooling constant, perhaps because you're learning from the skilled people, perhaps because they're more successful entrepreneurs who are giving you a job. 120 years ago, Alfred Marshall wrote that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air. And this idea remains more powerful today, I think, than it was when he wrote it. Unless we forget the importance of skills, this is the relationship between PISA math score and GDP per capita across the countries of the world. Now, well, surely the things that we teach in schools matter. Certainly the most important skills that are transmitted in cities have nothing to do with book learning in universities. There's skills that are picked up on the street. And it's hard to think of any skill that matters more for urban success than the inclination and talents to be an entrepreneur. 50 years ago, the economist Ben Chinitz compared New York and Pittsburgh and noticed that in the 1950s, New York was proving to be more resilient than Pittsburgh. He argued that New York's resilience reflected a culture of entrepreneurship that had been engendered by its industrial history. New York's greatest industry, as I've already mentioned, was the garment trade, an industry where anybody with a good idea and a couple of sewing machines could get started. Right? And the history of New York is replete with such individuals. Barriers to entry in this industry were notoriously low, either technological or regulatory. Indeed, I tell the story in my book of A.E. Lefcourt, the New Yorker who built more skyscrapers than any other New Yorker did prior to 1929, when he famously and foolishly declared that 1930 would be the greatest of all building years, showing an exuberance that is well known in the development trade. But A.E. Lefcourt got his start in the garment trade and got his start building because he transformed the garment area of New York. Now, whereas the garment trade was a mother of entrepreneurship, people like Sanford Weil's father got his start in the garment trade and sort of clearly transmitted some of that entrepreneurship to his son, other industries, right, like steel in Pittsburgh, are not. Right? Because of the vast returns to scale in this industry, you breed company men rather than entrepreneurs. And the middle managers at U.S. Steel or General Motors have no idea what new thing to do when steel goes down, right? Whereas the entrepreneurs do, because that's their whole business. They're looking for some form of opportunity. This is the Chinitz hypothesis. And indeed, it looks like there's a fair amount to support it, right? So it's remarkable, given how crappy our measures of entrepreneurship are, that they do such a good job predicting urban success. This is the two typical measures that we use are the share of employment in startups at some initial year or average establishment size. Both of them are enormously powerfully predictive of subsequent success. And there's a long literature now on this showing the effects within metropolitan areas, within industries, using instruments like the long run, like the presence of mines in the neighboring area to instrument for average firm size. But these measures do appear to be enormously predictive of urban success. Now, the most entrepreneurial place I've ever been is the Dharavi slum in Mumbai. Okay? You walk around Dharavi and you see in one room there are a couple of guys sewing brassieres and you feel like you're in the Lower East Side in 1905. And you go across the street, and there are people sitting on the floor sorting through plastic syringes, doing recycling of that. And then a little bit further down, there's a cluster of ceramics, right, making these beautiful little pots that they're so proud of, they're not even going to take any money from you for it. And then a little bit further down, there are guys who are recycling boxes. And recycling boxes mean you chop the boxes open, you turn them around, right, and you restaple them up so no one can see the old labels on them. Now, on one level, you feel to yourself just the hope of urban India, the remarkable strength of the Indian people to sort of work wonders when they're connected by cities. And then you walk out in the street and you see a kid defecating in the street. And you see the roads are not paved. And you see that the water, and you know that the water is not good to drink. Right? And it reminds you, right, that there are downsides as well as assets of density. If two people are close enough to give each other an idea face to face, they're also close enough to transmit a contagious disease. Right? And if someone's close enough to sell you a newspaper, they're also probably close enough to rob you. Right? And for 3,000 years, cities have been battling with the downsides of density. The problem of providing clean water, the problem of providing safety. Right? These are the negative externalities that come from proximity. This typically requires a robust public sector that is not present in India. Now, our own cities only became safe through massive investments, right? So at the start, in 1900, a boy born in New York City had a life expectancy that was 7 years less than the national average. Today, life expectancies are almost 3 years longer in New York City. No one really understands why that's true for older New Yorkers. For younger New Yorkers, the difference in mortality rates is quite clear where it's coming from. It's coming from lower levels of motor vehicle accidents. It's just a whole lot safer to get on the subway after you've had a few drinks than it is to get behind the wheel of a car. And lower levels of suicide. in big cities, which is more of a puzzle. One hypothesis that, is that this has to do with a culture of gun ownership in rural America, and certainly hunting licenses per capita are very strongly associated with teen suicide rates across counties in the United States. But the relative safety of cities didn't happen by accident. America's cities and towns, according to the work of David Cutler and Grant Miller, were spending as much on clean water at the start of the 20th century as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. And the work of Werner Troskin shows dramatic increases in health outcomes that came from public provision of water. Now, New York itself had a story of water provision that was slightly a bumpy road. These, of course, are two founding fathers, Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, and Burr would, of course, later shoot Hamilton on the shores of the Hudson. But before Burr shot Hamilton, he hired him to be his lawyer, because Burr had a scheme to get a bank. Right? And Burr's scheme involved winning public support for opening a bank, which was not a privilege granted out easily in the 1790s. The city was worried about water provision in the wake of the yellow fever epidemics of the 1790s, and Burr promised to provide a water company as long as it could do a little bit of banking. Hamilton made the case to his friends on the Federalist City Council that if they tried to do water publicly, it would lead to, quote unquote, burdensome taxes. Okay? The Federalist City Council went along, they gave Burr his deal. Now, anyone who's thought about incentive theory whatsoever thinks that this is an absolutely idiotic idea. You don't subsidize an entity to produce a relatively low return activity like providing clean water by giving them the right to do some alternative, unrelated, highly remunerative activity, which is exactly how this scheme worked, right? And unsurprisingly, this entity did a fair amount of banking and not a lot of water provision. And of course, here it is today. It's J.P. Morgan Chase that was the Chase Manhattan Bank that was the bank of the Manhattan Water Company, right? And indeed, it is not true that this octagon is the cross-section of a water pipe, which is what's claimed on Wikipedia. That is false. But if you want to sort of use that as a mnemonic to remember the story, you're more than welcome. Now, some problems, New York didn't get clean water until it had massive investments in public water technology. And indeed, water admitted allowed an engineering solution. There are other problems like congestion that do not. Okay? Congestion, you can't just build your way out of it. The work of the economists Gilles Duranton and Matthew Turner finds that vehicle miles traveled increase roughly 1-for-1 with highway miles built. If you build it, they will drive. And that's certainly what many of Robert Moses' projects in and around New York City found. Right? That doesn't mean that building is necessarily wrong, but it means you can't build your way out of traffic congestion. You need to actually charge people to use city streets. Right? You can't, basically America's cities are running a Soviet-style transport policy, by which I mean in the old Soviet Union, you'd had groceries that would give away eggs and dairy for way below market prices, and the result was long lines in stockouts. Well, today we give out something really valuable, which is, access to driving on Fifth Avenue. We give it away for free, and the result is the urban equivalent of long lines and stockouts, which is urban traffic jams and long lines. Now, if cities are able to deal with the downsides of density, they can be places of remarkable pleasure as well as productivity. The same things that make cities productive also makes them fun. The ability of entrepreneurship in urban restaurants, the ability of cities to cover large fixed costs. And one of the ways that we know that cities have become more fun is that in the 1970s, people earned a huge real wage premium for working in cities. Okay, that in fact prices weren't very high relative to wages. And the natural economic interpretation of this is that they were foregoing something, right? They were giving up something by being in the cities. Today they no longer pay that real wage premium. In fact, people are willing to in some sense accept a real wage discount to being in New York. The only way we can understand this is that if New York transformed from being a place in which it was fairly hellish to live to being a place that was fun. And we also see this, of course, in the rise of reverse commuting. Now, a downside if a place manages to succeed so well as a place of pleasure as well as productivity is that if it doesn't supply enough new housing, it risks turning into a boutique town affordable only to the wealthy. The declining line shows permits in Manhattan. The rising line shows rising prices. Just as New York got its act together as a place of that people wanted to live in, it made it more and more difficult to build. 15% of the land in Manhattan, excluding Central Park South and 96th Street, is in a historic preservation district right now. Right? And this is fundamentally what Jane Jacobs got wrong. Jacobs noted that old buildings were cheap and new buildings were expensive. And that led her to conclude that the way to promote housing affordability was to make sure that no one built any new building on top of old building. Okay? That's not how supply and demand works. If you make it impossible to build new homes, right, you make it impossible to supply new houses to the market. And you don't need to look any further than our own home area of Greenwich Village, which has been a preservation district for the last 40 years, right, to see the transformation wreaked, where a place that was affordable to ordinary income people like herself and her husband in the 1950s has become an area where townhouses start at $5 million and hedge fund managers only need apply. Now, this doesn't mean that historic preservation is always wrong. I'm the son of an architectural historian. I believe that our older buildings can be treasures for our cities. But every time we say no to new building, we're saying no to new families who want to move in the area, and we're ensuring that the families who do live in the area face higher prices. There isn't a free lunch here. And you've got to be sure that what you're preserving actually has enough value for the city relative to the costs it's imposing on ordinary families. I'm going to skip over this since I'm running out of time. But in Mumbai, in the developing world, the curse of over-restrictiveness is far more extreme. Mumbai has labored on a 1.25 floor area ratio, meaning the buildings have to be on average 1.25 floors. This is absolute madness and ensures that the city sprawls out rather than up, causing enormous damage to the city and its functionality and causing it to fail to do its transformative power for India as a whole. Now, one of the reasons, and I'll just end on this, one of the reasons why it's costly for cities like Mumbai to build is because of the environmental externalities associated with it. And I just want to end on this anecdote. Because cities are often seen as being the enemy of the environment, whereas in many ways the opposite is true. And this is an anecdote about the young Henry David Thoreau, who in a beautiful spring day went for a walk in the woods outside of Concord. And he did a little cooking, and he did a little fishing, and the fishing was good because there hadn't been a rain lately. But when he came to cook the fish into a chowder, the wind flicked the flames to the nearby dry grass, and a fire started and it spread. And by the time it was over, it had burned down more than 300 acres of prime Concord woodland, right, destroying a whole natural ecosystem. In his day, he was castigated as an enemy of the environment. The Concord Freemen called him a flibberty gibbet, which I think was pretty bad for 1844. Today, of course, he is venerated as a secular saint of American environmentalism, whose book, Walden, appears to preach a gospel of what a wonderful thing it is to live surrounded by woods, whereas his own life appears to give a very different moral, right? His own life seems to teach the gospel that we are a destructive species, and that if you love nature, the best thing to do is to stay away from it, as indeed Thoreau would have done nature a great deal of good if he had stayed at home in Cambridge and kept to his books rather than living around the woods. Now, I know of what I speak. I, too, moved from Cambridge when I started acquiring small kids. Only economists talk about acquiring small kids. About 6 years ago, and moved to a home not far away from Walden, and also started doing practically as much damage to the environment as he did. Together with Matthew Kahn, a UCLA environmental economist.
Is it Walden Pond?
Yeah, the woods around Walden. Woods around Walden.
That's true.
Yeah. Massive, more than 300 acres of woodland burned to the dust.
American romanticism you just killed.
It's a well-known story. It's not at all, with Matthew Kahn, I've tried to estimate carbon emissions associated with living in different parts of the country, and we found really substantial differences holding income and family size constant associated with urban living. This is coming both from shorter drives and smaller housing units. If the great growing economies of India and China see their per capita carbon emissions rise to that seen in the sprawling United States, global carbon emissions go up by about 130%. If they stop at the level seen at hyperdense Hong Kong, global carbon emissions go up by less than 30%, which is something to be wished, either because you're worried about global warming, or heck, if you're just worried about the price of gas at the pump. We've all got a lot to gain by China moving up rather than out. I think the conclusion of this is not meant to be that everyone should live in cities. It is a glorious thing that we have choice about where to live in this country. It's an absolute wonderful thing, right? But in fact, we should have policies that are relatively neutral. And the key is particularly rethinking those policies that have stacked the deck against urban areas. I've already mentioned the transportation policy that subsidized highways. Another thing to think very deeply about is the home mortgage interest deduction that essentially bribes Americans outside of urban apartments into suburban homes. More than 85% of single-family detached houses are owner-occupied, whereas more than 85% of multifamily houses are rented. Right? When you subsidize people to home ownership, you're basically telling them to leave urban apartments. And it's hard to see why the American dream can only lie behind a white picket fence in the suburb. And the third thing, of course, which is the biggest curse of urban areas, is the way that we structure our local public schools, which for so many parents in so many ways produces such a strong incentive to leave areas. And it's clear that solving that problem isn't easy, but it is in some sense the most important challenge, because cities and countries rise or fall on their stock of human capital. Thank you.
Just curious, since this is a university where, like universities, smart people get together and learn from each other, to draw on what you were saying. What struck me, I'm curious about your view about online learning, which is sort of developing rapidly, but it seems to lack that sort of face-to-face communication that you said you indicated was so important. So how have you formed a view on that?
I tend to think it's I tend to think it's useful to innovate in this area. That I think it's fine for us to be exploring things. I think it's very unlikely that it's going to replace the high-end product of actually being connected with other people, particularly because so much of the learning in schools is peer-to-peer. Right? At best, faculty have the chance to set the topic of conversation if the real learning is done when students connect with each other. I think part of the other magic of sort of face-to-face interactions in cities or schools is the unplanned stuff. Right? I mean, you can't just, think about sort of a young entrepreneur coming to Silicon Valley, right? You can't look up how to be a software entrepreneur on Wikipedia. You actually have to be in the middle of the action and pick up those random pieces of knowledge that are put down. Same thing for a young graduate student, right? Young graduate student, it's not that it's not that you need to know the particular articles. It's the sort of random things that you pick up from the people around you. So I think our product is pretty secure. I think that we still should be, exploring how to deliver lower cost versions of it online, because there are, it's a very high-end luxury product, but there are a lot of people in this world. So, yes. I tend to always stand on the side of freedom on these areas against restriction. There clearly are costs. We clearly have symbolic reasons for liking the monument to be high, but I certainly think Philadelphia significantly eased its height restrictions in recent decades, and I don't think that's done any significant damage to the fabric of the city. Personally, I find Washington, it's not dense enough in many of the areas. It creates too little of a walking town. So I would tend to be on the side of fewer restrictions in there. The only city that I've ever really taken seriously in terms of trying to estimate whether or not the height restrictions or various building restrictions were due is New York itself, where I've tried to estimate the social costs of building up an extra story versus the social benefits. And I've certainly convinced myself in New York that we make it too difficult to build up. But I'd need to run similar numbers for Washington, D.C. to be similarly confident. But certainly my gut would be that in high demand areas, making it easy to build is desirable.